She was 30 years old, worth $3 billion, and she had just made the worst mistake of her life, and she didn't even know it yet. One moment, Vanessa Sterling was pointing her finger at a quiet contract technician and ordering security to remove him from her hangar. The next, her phone rang. And the voice on the other end wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a board member, wasn't an investor. It was the Pentagon, and they weren't calling about her jet. They were calling about him. If you're new here, hit subscribe, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and smash that like button. Because this one goes deep. Stay with me until the very end. You do not want to miss what happens next. The rain had been falling since sundown. Not the gentle kind, the kind that comes sideways, the kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck no matter how you angle yourself against it. The kind of rain that makes a man question every decision that led him to be standing outside a private aviation hangar at nearly midnight on a Wednesday, holding a battered toolbox and squinting at a laminated badge that the security guard had already checked twice. Ryan Calder was used to being checked twice. He didn't look like he belonged in places like this, and that was fine by him. He was 32 years old, medium height, the kind of build that comes from being too busy to eat properly rather than any dedicated gym routine. His jacket was a dark olive canvas thing, the kind sold in 3-packs at farm supply stores, worn soft at the elbows. His boots were steel-toed and resoled once already. The toolbox was real aluminum, dented at the corners, and it weighed more than it looked because everything inside it was actual tools, rather than the decorative kind some contractors carried to look the part. The hangar itself was enormous. Sterling Aeronautics had built it 4 years ago on the eastern edge of a regional airfield outside Reston, Virginia, and from the outside it looked like every other industrial structure on that side of the field. Flat roof, corrugated panels, floodlights mounted at harsh angles that made the rain visible as individual silver lines dropping from the dark. But inside, it housed one of the most sophisticated private aircraft in the country. A modified Gulfstream G700, retrofitted with a classified emergency communications relay system that it had taken Sterling Aeronautics 18 months and roughly $40 million to develop in partnership with a defense subcontractor whose name didn't appear on any public record. Ryan had read the public brief on the contract, just the public brief. That was all he was supposed to have access to. He stepped through the side door, signed the second log sheet the guard pushed at him, and walked into the light. The hangar floor was bright and loud and smelled like hydraulic fluid and institutional coffee. There were maybe 20 people inside at various stages of pre-flight preparation: mechanics, technicians, 2 men in suits who looked like lawyers and moved like they were calculating their billing rate with every step. Near the aircraft's nose, a tall woman in a slate-gray blazer was speaking rapidly into a headset while simultaneously reviewing a tablet that a younger man held angled toward her. That was Vanessa Sterling. Ryan recognized her from the contractor briefing packet, a headshot on the cover page, the kind of executive photo where someone has clearly told the subject to smile but not too much, to look authoritative but approachable, to be simultaneously warm and intimidating. The photo had done a decent job. The real version was sharper. She was younger looking in person than the photo suggested, which was saying something given that the photo had been taken less than a year ago. She moved with the controlled energy of someone who had been awake since 5 in the morning and was operating entirely on focus and forward momentum, the kind of energy that doesn't come from caffeine, but from something closer to pressure. The specific alertness that comes when you know that the next few hours will determine whether something you spent years building survives or doesn't. Ryan didn't walk toward her. He walked toward the aircraft. He'd been contracted through a third-party maintenance firm, Altitude Technical Services, specifically for this pre-flight certification window. His role was secondary inspection, systems verification, cross-checking the maintenance logs against actual physical aircraft condition, signing off on anomalies or clearances within his certification scope. Routine work. The kind of work where most contract technicians spent 2 hours, found nothing interesting, signed the paperwork, and went home. Ryan set his toolbox down near the starboard wing root, clipped his inspection light to his collar, and opened the first log. Wow, he almost missed it. The maintenance records for the secondary pressurization system were clean. Too clean, actually. Every timestamp rounded to the nearest hour, which was unusual in practice because real maintenance work never happened in round numbers. Real work happened at 11:07 and 2:34 and 9:51. Round time stamps were the kind of thing that happened when someone was filling in a log after the fact rather than recording it as they worked. Ryan turned the page. The approval signatures on the communications relay inspection were clean too. All three of them. Same pen pressure on every signature, which was statistically unlikely when three different people signed documents at different times on different surfaces with different levels of fatigue. People's signatures are never perfectly consistent. These were nearly identical. He turned another page. Then he stopped. He set the log down on top of his toolbox and stood very still for a moment, the way a man does when something is telling him to slow down and look more carefully. Ryan Calder had spent 4 years doing classified aircraft safety protocol work before he'd left that world behind to raise his daughter. He had looked at thousands of maintenance logs in those 4 years. He had reviewed pre-flight documentation on aircraft worth more than most small nations' annual defense budgets. And in 4 years of that work, he had developed a very specific, very particular feeling that arrived in his chest whenever something was wrong with a document that was supposed to tell him something was right. He was feeling it now. He pulled out his own inspection light and crouched beneath the aircraft's fuselage, near the pressurization system access panel. The panel was seated perfectly. Screws all tight, no visible marks around the fasteners, no scuffing on the surrounding surface. Everything looked exactly the way it should look, which was the problem. Ryan had seen this panel opened 6 days ago, according to the maintenance log. In 6 days of normal hangar activity, foot traffic, equipment movement, vibration from neighboring aircraft operations, a panel that had been opened and reseated should have at minimum minor dust settlement around the fastener heads. There should have been a faint pressure ridge from the gasket. There should have been the invisible evidence of time and air and ordinary existence that accumulates on surfaces, whether you pay attention to it or not. The panel looked like it had been opened and reseated within the last few hours. Ryan straightened up slowly. He stood there for a moment with his inspection light in one hand and the maintenance log in the other, and he did the kind of quiet, patient arithmetic that nobody sees happening but that changes everything. Then he walked to the fueling station. "Hold on the fuel," he said to the technician running the line. The technician, a young guy, maybe 23, wearing earphones and a fluorescent safety vest, looked up. "Excuse me? I need you to hold on the fuel for this aircraft. Don't complete the fill." "Sir, the fuel order is already logged. I can't just—" "I know you can't on your own authority," Ryan said. He kept his voice level, the way you keep your voice level when you are trying not to frighten someone into doing something reactive and stupid. "I'm not asking you to cancel it. I'm asking you to pause it for right now until I speak to someone with authorization to confirm. Can you do that?" The technician hesitated. Then he looked at Ryan's badge. Then he looked at the log Ryan was carrying. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I can do that." The man who stepped into Ryan's path 60 seconds later was Derek Vaughn. He was 46 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of haircut and posture that belongs to men who have spent decades in operations management, precise, slightly aggressive, permanently convinced that any problem was ultimately a logistics problem, and any person creating friction was ultimately a resource allocation problem. He'd been with Sterling Aeronautics for 3 years, and in that time had built a reputation as the person who got things done, which in Vanessa Sterling's world meant the person who removed obstacles. He was currently looking at Ryan the way a man looks at an obstacle. "What's the issue with the fuel sequence?" Derek said. Not asked. Said. "I need to talk to Ms. Sterling," Ryan said. "Ms. Sterling is occupied. I'm operations director. Whatever you've got, you bring it to me." Ryan looked at him for a moment. "Okay," he said. "The secondary pressurization system on this aircraft shows evidence of access within the last several hours that doesn't match the maintenance log, which indicates the last access was 6 days ago. The communications relay inspection signatures are inconsistent with organic human variation in a way that suggests they were produced in one sitting rather than by 3 separate individuals at separate times. And this aircraft is scheduled to carry personnel and classified equipment on a defense demonstration flight in—" Ryan checked his watch. "Less than 5 hours. Derek's expression didn't change. That too was information. "Those are significant findings, Calder," Derek said, after a pause of exactly the right length. Long enough to seem thoughtful, short enough to seem confident. "But I've got to be honest with you. We've had 4 separate teams through this aircraft in the last 72 hours. The maintenance documentation has been reviewed by our senior flight engineer and 2 federal certification officers. What you're describing sounds like cosmetic irregularities. The irregularities I'm describing, Ryan said, are not cosmetic. I hear you. Derek's voice had the smooth, reasonable texture of a man who had been in a lot of rooms with a lot of difficult people and had learned exactly how to make them feel managed. Here's what I'd like to do. You finish your inspection scope, you flag the items in your report, and we'll have our senior engineer review your findings before we finalize the fuel sequence. Does that work for you? Ryan knew exactly what that meant. It meant, write it down, and we'll make your write-up disappear into a review process that never produces a result. And in the meantime, the aircraft gets fueled and airborne, and what happens after that is no longer your problem. No, Ryan said. That doesn't work for me. Derek's expression changed then, just slightly. Something behind his eyes that had been still went taut. Excuse me? I need to speak to Ms. Sterling directly, Ryan said. Right now. Vanessa Sterling turned away from her tablet conversation when Derek appeared at her shoulder with the contract technician behind him. She registered Ryan in the way she registered most things in a busy pre-flight window, quickly, categorically, and with the assumption that the information would turn out to be manageable. This is Ryan Calder, from Altitude Technical, Derek said. He has some concerns he'd like to raise about the inspection. Vanessa looked at Ryan. How serious? Serious enough that I stopped the fuel sequence, Ryan said. A shift in the temperature of the room, not dramatic, but present. 3 nearby technicians who had been pretending not to listen stopped pretending. You stopped my fuel sequence, Vanessa said. Yes. On what authority? On the authority of my certification scope, which covers anomaly identification requiring a flight operations hold. Ms. Sterling, I found evidence that the secondary pressurization system on this aircraft was accessed within the last few hours by someone who then modified the maintenance log to suggest it wasn't. I've also found approval signatures on the communications relay inspection that are inconsistent with being produced by 3 separate individuals. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Her eyes moved to Derek, then back to Ryan. What's your background? She said. It was a fair question and Ryan knew it. He looked like a contract technician. He looked like a man who drove an older truck and brought his own coffee because hangar vending machines charged $3 for something tasting like rust. He did not look like a man whose opinion should stop a billion-dollar defense demonstration flight. I've got the certifications in my inspection packet, Ryan said. I'm happy to walk through them, but I'd rather spend the next 10 minutes showing you the actual irregularities in the maintenance log. 10 minutes, Ms. Sterling. If I'm wrong, you restart the fuel sequence and I'll write the cleanest anomaly-free report you've ever seen. Something moved across Vanessa Sterling's face, a flicker of calculation maybe, or the beginning of it, but Derek was already stepping forward. Ms. Sterling, Derek said, and his voice had shifted into something quieter and more urgent, pitched just for her. We've got a 40-minute window before we lose our pre-flight sequencing slot. If we hold the fuel now, we lose the slot, and if we lose the slot, we're looking at a 6-hour delay that puts us past the demonstration window. You know what that means for the contract. Vanessa knew what it meant. Ryan could see her know it, could see the weight of it settle across her shoulders in real time. Hundreds of millions of dollars. 18 months of work. A defense contract that would change the trajectory of Sterling Aeronautics for the next decade. Against the concern of a contract technician she'd never heard of, holding a worn toolbox, with mud still on the toes of his boots from the parking lot. She made a decision. Mr. Calder, Vanessa said, and her voice had changed. It had become the CEO voice now, precise and final, and carrying the particular quality of someone who has made 1,000 hard calls and stopped second-guessing themselves after the first 100. I appreciate your diligence. Your concerns will be documented and reviewed, but this aircraft is not grounded on a secondary contractor's read of a maintenance log. Derek, restart the fuel sequence. Ms. Sterling, Ryan started. I'm done, she said. She wasn't angry. That was almost worse. She was simply finished. Finish your inspection scope, file your report, and have it submitted to Derek's office by 0200. Ryan stood there for 1 second. Just one. A man taking inventory of a situation, running numbers, arriving at a conclusion. I can't in good conscience clear this aircraft for flight, he said. Vanessa turned back to him. The room had gone very quiet. I beg your pardon? If this aircraft leaves the ground tonight with what I've found, I cannot sign a clearance for it. That's not an escalation, Ms. Sterling. That's just what my certification scope requires. The silence stretched another half-second before Vanessa Sterling took one step toward him and said, in a voice that was completely controlled and absolutely cold, "Touch my jet again, and you're finished. You understand me? Not just this contract. I will make sure every aviation services firm in the Mid-Atlantic region knows your name." Security was already moving from the side of the hangar. Ryan didn't argue. He didn't raise his hands or make it dramatic. He simply turned. And as he turned, his hand dropped almost casually to a secondary control panel mounted beside the fueling station access point. His fingers found a recessed toggle that most people in this hangar probably didn't know existed. He pressed it. A sound moved through the aircraft. Not loud, not alarming. A series of low, sequential tones that any experienced military aviation technician would have recognized immediately. Most of the people in this hangar were not experienced military aviation technicians. Derek recognized it. Ryan saw his face change. 3 external access ports on the aircraft sealed themselves. The fuel coupling locked. The boarding ramp retracted 2 inches, just enough to break the electrical handshake with the ground crew system. The aircraft was not moving anywhere. "What did you do?" Derek said. His voice had changed completely. The smooth operations manager texture was entirely gone. Something rawer and sharper had replaced it. "That's a passive military safety protocol," Ryan said. "It's coded to my certification credentials. To deactivate it, you need either a matching credential or a direct override from the issuing federal authority. I don't recommend trying to force it. The aircraft's diagnostic systems will flag any unauthorized override attempt directly to the Pentagon's Aviation Safety Office." Derek stared at him. "That is sabotage." "No," Ryan said. "What I found in that maintenance log is sabotage." The room had completely stopped. Every person on the hangar floor was either staring openly or staring at the floor with the intense focus of people who are very aware of what they're not looking at. Vanessa Sterling was staring at Ryan Calder. Her phone rang. She answered it without looking away from him. "Sterling." A pause. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something shifted in the quality of her stillness. She said, "Yes. He's standing right in front of me." Another pause. "I understand," she said. She lowered the phone. The entire hangar was waiting. Vanessa Sterling looked at Ryan Calder for a long moment. The single dad with the worn jacket and the borrowed toolbox and the mud on his boots. And something that might have been the beginning of a terrible and clarifying understanding moved across her face. Then Derek's access badge emitted a sharp 3-tone alert. He looked down at it. Something in his expression went very still, the way a man goes still when he realizes the trap has already closed. And the only question now is, how long before everyone else sees it too? In the far corner of the hangar, a secondary maintenance terminal flickered and began erasing its session history. Ryan saw it. He said very quietly, "Nobody touched that terminal." Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the Gulfstream G700 sat locked and still on the hangar floor, surrounded by people who had been very sure of what was happening an hour ago and were now sure of nothing at all. Ryan Calder set his toolbox down beside the aircraft's nose, opened it, and went back to work. He hadn't been wrong about the pressurization system. He hadn't been wrong about the signatures. And the night, it turned out, was just getting started. The terminal in the corner was still flickering. Ryan was already moving toward it before the last word had left his mouth, cutting across the hangar floor at a pace that wasn't quite running, but covered ground, the way a man moves when he knows that every second costs something real. Behind him, he could hear voices rising. Derek saying something sharp and clipped to one of the security guards. 2 of the suited lawyers talking over each other, someone on a headset asking for clarification that nobody was in a position to give. "I said nobody touched that terminal," Ryan repeated, louder this time, without turning around. He reached it in 12 seconds. The screen was cycling through a deletion sequence. Not a standard system logout, not a scheduled cache clear. This was a manual wipe, the kind you initiate when you need something gone, and you need it gone before anyone has time to ask what it was. Folder structures were collapsing on the screen in real time, maintenance records folding into themselves and disappearing like paper burning from the inside out. Ryan sat down at the chair in front of the terminal, set 2 fingers on the keyboard, and stopped the sequence cold. It wasn't complicated, technically. It was the kind of move that looks like magic to people who don't know the system and looks like basic muscle memory to people who do. Ryan had spent enough time inside classified aviation network architecture to know that manual deletion sequences on federally linked maintenance systems had a mandatory pause buffer, a 3-second window built into the protocol precisely to prevent exactly what was happening right now. You just had to know where the pause lived in the command hierarchy. He found it. He pressed it. The screen froze. Then Ryan pulled a secondary drive from the lower compartment of his toolbox, connected it to the terminal's auxiliary port, and began copying everything that had been in the deletion queue back onto readable storage before the sequence could resume. He worked quietly and fast. Around him, the hangar had reorganized itself into something that felt less like a pre-flight operation and more like a room where people were waiting to find out how badly they'd misread a situation. Vanessa Sterling was standing 8 feet behind him. He could feel it without looking. The quality of her silence had changed from the silence of a CEO managing an irritant to something more careful and more uncertain. She was a woman who made fast decisions and trusted them, and right now she was in the specific discomfort of someone whose fast decision had just been called into question by a federal phone call she hadn't expected. Derek Vaughn was standing near the aircraft's tail, talking to one of the lawyers in a voice too low to carry across the floor. His body language was the body language of a man explaining something, but his eyes kept moving back to Ryan's terminal. Ryan noticed. He filed it away and kept copying. It took 4 minutes and 20 seconds to pull everything out of the deletion queue. Ryan ejected the drive, pocketed it, and stood up from the terminal chair. His lower back ached slightly. He'd been hunched over the keypad, and he straightened himself out with the unconscious routine of a man who spent a lot of time crouching under aircraft and had learned to just live with it. He turned around. Vanessa was closer than he'd expected. She'd moved without him hearing her, which told him something about how she operated. She was a person who got close to problems rather than managing them from a comfortable distance. It was probably one of the things that had made her company as successful as it was. It was also clearly making her very uncomfortable right now, being this close to a problem she didn't yet fully understand. "What just happened?" she said. "Someone initiated a remote wipe on the maintenance terminal," Ryan said. "They were pulling everything related to the pressurization system access logs and the communications relay records. I stopped it and pulled the data onto a separate drive." "Remote," Vanessa said. "You said remote." "The wipe command didn't originate from this terminal's keyboard. It was sent in from an authenticated administrative account through the network. Whoever did it, they weren't standing at this machine when they started it." Vanessa looked at the terminal, then back at Ryan. Her jaw was set in a way that wasn't anger exactly. It was the expression of a person doing very fast, very uncomfortable arithmetic. "So someone in this building has administrative access to our maintenance network and just tried to delete records while—" She stopped, started again. "While a federal safety hold was being placed on my aircraft." "That's what it looks like, yes." She looked at him for a moment. He could see her working through the implications in real time, laying them out and turning them over the way you turn over a piece of machinery to see where the damage actually starts. "The Pentagon call," she said. "They asked if you were still in the building." "Yes." "Why would they ask that?" Ryan considered his answer for a beat. Not because he didn't know it, but because some answers, once you give them, change the shape of a conversation permanently. "Because my certification credentials are what activated the safety hold on the aircraft. And because my background, some of it, is on file with their Aviation Safety Oversight Division." "Some of it," Vanessa repeated. "Yes." She studied him the way she'd probably studied 100 contracts, looking for the line where the language stopped being clear. "Who are you exactly, Mr. Calder?" "Right now," Ryan said, "I'm the guy who stopped your aircraft from leaving the ground tonight. Everything else is secondary." It wasn't evasion exactly. It was prioritization, which Ryan had found over the years was a thing most people in crisis mode actually responded to better than a full biography. Vanessa Sterling looked at him for another second, and something in her expression shifted. Not softening, exactly. More like recalibrating. "What do you need?" she said. "Full access to your maintenance records network. Physical access to the pressurization system and the communications relay housing, and I need everyone who isn't essential to keep back from the aircraft. Vanessa turned and found Derek in her line of sight. Derek, I heard him, Derek said, moving toward them from the aircraft's tail. His voice was back to the smooth operational register, but something underneath it had changed. There was a tightness in his face that hadn't been there an hour ago. Ms. Sterling, I want to be careful here. We're talking about giving a secondary contract technician unrestricted access to classified systems architecture on an aircraft that's scheduled for a federal demonstration flight. I don't think we've adequately verified. The Pentagon called me, Derek, Vanessa said, directly, on my secure line, and they asked if he was still in the building. A pause. They didn't ask about you. Derek was quiet. Give him what he's asking for, Vanessa said. Ryan worked methodically, the way he always worked when the stakes were high enough that rushing was the same as failing. He moved through the pressurization system access panel first, the one that had looked too clean, too recently reseated, and what he found underneath it confirmed what he'd suspected from the outside. The secondary pressurization valve had been manually adjusted, not replaced, not damaged in any visible way, adjusted. The setting had been moved to a position that would read as normal during standard ground inspection, but would cause a progressive pressure differential at altitude. Not enough to trigger immediate alarms, enough to create a slow building problem that would become critical somewhere over the demonstration flight path, at altitude, with personnel and classified communications equipment aboard. Ryan photographed everything. He documented the valve position, the tool marks on the adjustment housing, the specific calibration numbers. Then he moved to the communications relay housing and found the second piece of it. The relay's authentication certificates, the digital credentials the system used to verify its own integrity during operation, had been replaced. New certificates, issued under what appeared to be a legitimate internal approval chain, but with a specific embedded parameter that would cause the relay to flag a false security breach during the demonstration. The aircraft's military systems would interpret it as a hostile signal intrusion attempt and go into automatic lockdown. In front of a room full of Pentagon brass evaluating whether to award Sterling Aeronautics the contract, Vanessa's aircraft would effectively tell the military it couldn't be trusted. Ryan sat back on his heels inside the relay housing access bay and looked at what he was looking at. This wasn't random. This wasn't an opportunistic sabotage by someone who wanted to delay a flight or create a nuisance. This was engineered, carefully, patiently, by someone who understood the specific technical systems well enough to build a failure that looked like organic malfunction until you were close enough to see the fingerprints. Whoever had done this had wanted Vanessa Sterling's aircraft to fail in the worst possible way, at the worst possible moment, in front of the only audience whose opinion could end her company. Ryan climbed back out of the access bay, straightened up, and walked to where Vanessa was standing near the nose of the aircraft, arms crossed, watching him with the concentrated attention of a person trying to read a situation by reading the person closest to the center of it. Tell me, she said. He told her. All of it. The valve adjustment, the certificate replacement, the specific failure modes, what each one would have meant at altitude during the demonstration. He didn't soften it and he didn't dramatize it. He just described what he'd found the same way he would have described it in a technical briefing. Because the most respectful thing you could do for a person in Vanessa Sterling's position right now was treat her like someone capable of handling the actual information. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. If we'd flown tonight, she said, the pressurization issue would have become critical somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes into the flight. The relay failure would have triggered before that during the initial demonstration sequence. People could have been hurt. Yes. She absorbed that. Ryan watched her absorb it, watched the specific way it landed on someone who had been operating all night on the assumption that the biggest risk she was facing was a delayed flight. The shift from that to this was not a small one. Someone built this, she said. Someone who knew the systems. Yes. Someone with access. Yes. Her eyes moved almost involuntarily toward Derek Vaughn, then back to Ryan. She hadn't said it out loud yet. Ryan didn't say it either. There was an order to these things, and saying it before he had documented proof wasn't useful to anyone. I need to get into your administrative access records, Ryan said, the network logs that show which accounts access the maintenance record system and when. Derek has admin credentials for that system, Vanessa said. Her voice was careful, flat in a deliberate way. "I know," Ryan said. "Can you access those logs independently, without going through his credentials?" Vanessa was quiet for 2 seconds. "My executive override can pull a read-only audit log from the network server directly. I've never used it. It exists for compliance purposes." Another pause. "I'd need my system administrator to walk me through it." "Get her," Ryan said. The system administrator was a 28-year-old woman named Claire, who had been standing near the back of the hangar for the last 40 minutes, watching the situation develop with the wide-eyed attention of someone who had suspected for a while that something was wrong with the company she worked for, but had never had a specific reason to say so out loud. When Vanessa found her and explained what she needed, Claire pulled up the audit log access protocol on her own laptop without being asked twice. Ryan sat beside her, and they went through the logs together. The administrative account access records for the maintenance network were time-stamped and IP-coded. What Ryan found in them took him 11 minutes to fully map and another 2 minutes to verify, cross-checking the access timestamps against the maintenance log entries he'd flagged in his original inspection. The pressurization system records had been modified 3 times in the last 18 hours. All 3 modifications had come from the same administrative account, Derek Vaughn's. The communications relay authentication certificates had been updated 9 hours ago, same account. The deletion sequence that had started on the terminal when Ryan activated the safety hold, the remote wipe that had tried to pull everything before anyone could look at it too carefully, had been initiated 4 minutes after the Pentagon call came in, from Derek Vaughn's account, from an IP address that corresponded to a personal mobile device currently logged into the hangar's internal network. Ryan printed the log on Claire's portable printer. He held the pages in his hands and looked at them for a moment with the particular feeling of a man who has found what he was looking for and doesn't feel good about it. He brought them to Vanessa. She looked at the pages for a long time, long enough that Ryan started to wonder whether she was reading them or just holding them, while she processed something that had nothing to do with the technical data on the paper. 3 years, she said finally. Her voice was quiet, not broken. Vanessa Sterling wasn't the kind of person who broke in front of a room full of employees, but there was something in it that was raw at the edges in a way the CEO voice couldn't entirely cover. "He's been with me for 3 years. Ryan didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say to that. "Why?" she said. The question wasn't really directed at Ryan. It was the kind of question people ask when they already know the answer might be worse than the question. "I don't know the full picture yet," Ryan said. "But the pattern of what was built here, said the specific failure modes, the timing, the way it was constructed to look like equipment malfunction rather than deliberate interference. This wasn't done out of personal grievance. This was done for a specific outcome. Someone wanted your company to fail in a way that was predictable enough to plan around." Vanessa looked up from the pages. "Plan around?" "If you know a company is going to fail," Ryan said carefully, "and you know when, and you know it's going to fail in a way that drives the stock price and the valuation down fast, that's useful information for the right kind of investor." The silence that followed that statement had a different quality than the silences that had come before it. This one had weight. Vanessa set the pages down on the top of Ryan's toolbox. She straightened up. Something had settled in her face. Not resolved, not calm exactly, but set. The expression of a person who has just located the actual problem and is redirecting everything toward it. "Where is Derek right now?" she said. Ryan looked across the hangar floor. Derek Vaughn had been visible near the aircraft's tail 8 minutes ago, talking to the lawyers. Now the space where he'd been standing was empty. The lawyers were still there. Derek wasn't. Ryan scanned the hangar. Storage area, clear. Near the fuel station, clear. The secondary access corridor that ran along the north wall. The restricted service passage that led to the network equipment room and the back maintenance office. The door to that corridor was just easing shut. Ryan was moving before he'd fully formed the thought. "Tell security to seal that corridor," he said over his shoulder. "Both ends. Right now." Vanessa's voice cut across the hangar floor with the specific authority of a person who has spent a decade making sure that when she speaks in a room, the room responds. "Security, North Service Corridor, seal both access points. Nobody in or out." The 2 guards near the main entrance were moving within 3 seconds. Ryan reached the corridor door and stopped outside it rather than going through. If Derek was in there and had heard the call to seal the corridor, going in alone through a single entrance was not intelligent. Ryan stood at the door and listened. A sound from inside. A footstep, then a scraping sound, then a muttered word he couldn't make out. The guard from the far end of the corridor appeared through a secondary access panel that Ryan hadn't known was there, which meant Derek hadn't made it to the network equipment room yet. 40 seconds later, Derek Vaughn emerged from the corridor door with both hands visible and a face that had completed the transformation Ryan had been watching begin for the last hour. All the smooth, competent operations manager texture entirely gone, replaced by something that looked like a man doing calculations that kept coming out wrong. He looked at Ryan. Ryan looked back at him. "There's nothing in there," Derek said. "I was checking the network relay panel." "At midnight," Ryan said. "We're running a defense demonstration flight. The network relay panel is relevant to—" "Derek," Vanessa's voice came from behind Ryan. "Stop talking." Derek stopped talking. One of the security guards reached for the mobile device clipped to Derek's belt. The personal phone that was still logged into the hangar's internal network from the IP address that had initiated the deletion sequence. "Don't touch that," Derek said, and his voice had changed again, harder now, the smooth professionalism entirely abandoned. "You don't have the authority to—" "Call federal security," Vanessa said quietly to the guard. "Not Derek's security. Not the building's contracted service. Federal." Derek looked at the room around him, at the guards, at the lawyers who had stopped talking and were now watching with the careful blankness of people calculating their own exposure, at Claire with her laptop and the printed audit logs, at Ryan Calder standing in front of the sealed corridor door with his toolbox nearby and the secondary drive in his pocket. He looked at Vanessa. Something in his face changed one more time, not to fear exactly, but to something adjacent to it, something that in another man might have resolved into an apology or a confession, but in Derek Vaughn resolved into silence. Vanessa held his gaze for 3 long seconds, then she turned away from him and toward Ryan. "Tell me what else you need," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. Ryan could see the faint tension in them, the small involuntary grip of someone holding themselves together through a specific act of will. But she was holding. Ryan looked at the aircraft. At the pressurization system access panel, reseated and waiting. At the communications relay housing, with its replaced certificates and its engineered failure sequence sitting dormant inside it. At the maintenance logs on his clipboard and the evidence on the drive in his pocket and the 4.5 hours remaining before dawn. "I need to get back to work," Ryan said. He picked up his toolbox and walked back toward the aircraft. Behind him, he could hear Vanessa Sterling exhale, just once, just quietly. And then he heard her straighten her shoulders in that particular way people do when they have found the bottom of something terrible and decided to start climbing. The rain was still hitting the hangar roof. The aircraft was still locked. And Derek Vaughn was standing in the middle of a room where, 11 minutes ago, he had been the most trusted person. Ryan opened his toolbox, found the tool he needed, and went back to work. The secondary drive sat on top of Ryan's toolbox, like a small, unremarkable piece of plastic that happened to contain enough information to end a man's career and possibly his freedom. Ryan had set it there deliberately, where he could see it without reaching for it. A habit from his earlier work, keeping the most critical piece of evidence in your peripheral vision so you always knew exactly where it was. He worked through the pressurization system first, because that was the physical problem, the one that existed in metal and calibration settings rather than in data. The valve adjustment was deliberate and precise. Whoever had done it understood the system well enough to know exactly how far to move the setting before it crossed from within tolerance into flagged on inspection. They'd stayed just inside the line. On a standard pre-flight check by someone who wasn't specifically looking for tampering, it would have passed. On a ground inspection by a technician running through a checklist at midnight with a demonstration deadline pressing down on the room, it absolutely would have passed. Ryan reset the valve to its correct position, documented the original setting and the corrected setting with photographs and written measurements, and moved on. The communications relay was more complicated. The authentication certificate replacement was clean work, technically clean, meaning whoever had done it knew the system's credential architecture well enough to insert new certificates through a legitimate-looking approval chain. If Ryan had been looking at the relay documentation in isolation, without the context of everything else he'd already found, He might have spent an extra 20 minutes convincing himself it was legitimate before his instincts overrode his optimism. With the full picture in front of him, the embedded parameter that would trigger the false security breach during the demonstration. Stuck out the way a wrong note sticks out in a song you've heard 1,000 times. Not obvious to everyone in the room, obvious to anyone who actually knew the music. He documented it. Then he flagged the certificates for federal review rather than removing them himself, because removing them without federal authorization would compromise the evidentiary chain. That decision cost him time he didn't entirely have, but taking shortcuts with evidence in a situation like this was the kind of thing that came back and made every fact you'd found feel questionable. Claire had stayed near the terminal with her laptop, working quietly and not getting in Ryan's way, which Ryan appreciated more than he said out loud. At one point, she appeared at his elbow with a paper cup of coffee, not the vending machine variety, the real kind from a press pot someone kept in the back office, and set it on top of the toolbox without saying anything. Ryan drank half of it without looking up from the relay housing. It was the best thing that had happened to him since he'd arrived at this hangar. Across the floor, Vanessa Sterling was on her phone. She'd been on her phone almost continuously for the last 40 minutes. Not the aggressive, striding around kind of phone call that suggested someone performing urgency, but the concentrated, low-voiced kind that meant actual work was happening. Federal contacts, Ryan assumed. Legal team, possibly her board, though board calls at this hour tended to be brief and brutal, and this one seemed to be running long. Derek Vaughn was seated near the hangar's side wall under the specific kind of watchful proximity that meant security wasn't going to let him walk anywhere without an audience. He wasn't handcuffed, that wasn't the security team's authority, but the physical geometry of the situation communicated clearly enough. His lawyer had arrived 20 minutes ago, a compact man in an expensive coat who had immediately established a perimeter of quiet around his client and was currently doing the thing lawyers do when they want to appear relaxed at a scene of catastrophic professional crisis, which is to stand very still and say very little. Derek himself hadn't spoken since Vanessa had told him to stop talking. He sat with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, doing what looked like the kind of internal accounting that happens when a long and complicated plan encounters the specific obstacle it wasn't designed for. Ryan glanced at him once, briefly, from the relay housing access bay. Then he went back to work. It was Claire who found the investment connection. She hadn't been looking for it specifically. She'd been cross-referencing the network access logs with the maintenance record modification timestamps, building a cleaner timeline for the federal review, when she found a secondary file pathway that shouldn't have existed in the maintenance network at all. It was a compressed archive, tucked inside a folder labeled with an equipment serial number that didn't correspond to any piece of equipment currently in the hangar. The kind of thing that would be invisible in a routine audit because it looked like administrative noise. A mislabeled file, a data artifact, the kind of digital clutter that accumulates in any large network over time. Claire almost scrolled past it. Instead, she opened it. "Ryan," she said. He heard something in her voice, a flatness that meant she was controlling a stronger reaction, and he came to her laptop within 30 seconds. The archive contained 14 documents: financial projections, internal correspondence, draft term sheets. The correspondence was between Derek Vaughn's personal email account and an investment group called Carver Meridian Capital. Ryan had never heard of Carver Meridian Capital, but the documents described them clearly enough. A private equity fund with a stated strategy of acquiring distressed defense sector companies at significant discount to their pre-crisis valuation. The term sheets outlined a proposed acquisition of Sterling Aeronautics. The projected acquisition price was based on a specific assumed valuation, a valuation that would only make sense if Sterling Aeronautics had just lost its primary defense contract in a public and spectacular way. The timeline in the documents aligned almost exactly with the date of tonight's military demonstration flight. Ryan read through the documents twice. Not because he'd missed anything the first time, but because when you find something this clear, this organized, this plainly documented, your first instinct is that you must be misreading it. It was almost too complete. Derek had kept records of everything: the correspondence, the projections, the acquisition timeline. The kind of meticulous documentation that careful, systematic people accumulate almost involuntarily, because careful and systematic people trust their own records more than their own memory. It was the documentation habit of a man who had never genuinely believed he'd be caught. Print all of it, Ryan told Claire. She was already printing. Ryan stood up and walked to where Vanessa was standing. She was still on her phone, but she saw him coming and ended her call without ceremony. "What?" she said. Ryan handed her the first 3 pages. He watched her read them. He'd watched Vanessa Sterling absorb difficult information twice tonight. Once when he'd told her about the aircraft sabotage, and once when she'd seen Derek's name on the audit logs. Both times she'd taken it with the compressed, controlled reaction of a person who processes impact internally and shows you the aftermath rather than the moment of it. This time was different. This time he could see it hit her, not the financial threat. Vanessa Sterling had lived with financial threat as a constant companion since she'd started this company at 24 years old with borrowed capital and a technical concept that most of the people she pitched to told her was 5 years too early. She knew what financial threat felt like. This wasn't that. This was the 3 years. The 3 years of Derek Vaughn sitting across from her in planning meetings and budget reviews and late-night operational crises, offering solutions and building systems, and being the reliable operational architecture of a company she'd bled for. 3 years of trusting someone to execute her vision while he was simultaneously mapping the architecture of how to destroy it and sell the wreckage at a profit. Vanessa set the pages down on Ryan's toolbox next to the secondary drive. She was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "He attended my mother's funeral," she said. The sentence landed in the air between them with the particular weight of an irrelevant fact that was also somehow the most relevant fact of all. Ryan didn't say anything. There wasn't a response to that. It wasn't a question, and it didn't need an answer. It was just a thing that was true. And sometimes true things need a second to exist before you move past them. "How long has he been in contact with this investment group?" Vanessa asked. "The earliest correspondence in the archive is dated 14 months ago," Ryan said. Vanessa absorbed that. 14 months ago, Derek Vaughn had been helping her negotiate the initial federal contract that would become tonight's demonstration flight. He'd been in the room for those conversations. He'd helped structure the timeline. "He helped us win the contract," she said. Flat. Not quite disbelieving. More like reading a fact off a wall in a language she hadn't expected to find there. "He needed you to win it," Ryan said. "The acquisition value is based on the assumption that you had the contract and lost it. A company that never won the contract isn't worth the same price to a fund that specializes in distressed acquisitions. He needed you to have it, and then he needed you to lose it, specifically, in the worst possible way, at the moment of maximum visibility." Vanessa looked at him. "Tonight was never supposed to be about the flight," she said slowly. "The flight was the mechanism. Tonight was about destroying the company's credibility with the Pentagon in a way that couldn't be recovered from." "Yes." "And then Carver Meridian Capital moves in while the stock is collapsed and the board is in crisis mode and picks up the pieces at," she checked the pages, "40 cents on the dollar. Based on the projected acquisition price in those term sheets, roughly." Vanessa set the pages down. She looked at Derek across the hangar floor. Not with the hot, visible anger that Ryan might have expected from some people in this situation, but with something colder and more deliberate. The look of a person deciding what to do with information rather than reacting to the feeling of it. Derek, across the room, was looking back at her. Whatever calculation he'd been running in his internal accounting had apparently reached some kind of conclusion, because his expression had settled into something that was almost unreadable. Not quite defiant, not quite resigned, the careful blankness of a man waiting to see which direction the situation moved before he decided how to move with it. "I want everything on that archive sent to the federal contact I've been speaking to tonight," Vanessa said to Claire, without taking her eyes off Derek. "Right now, before anything else changes." "Already drafted the transfer," Claire said quietly from behind her laptop. "I just need your authorization." Vanessa reached over and keyed her authorization code without looking at the screen. "Send it, or..." The federal contacts arrived at the hangar at 1:47 in the morning. There were 3 of them, 2 from the Aviation Safety Oversight Division, whose number had appeared on Vanessa's phone earlier, and 1 from a federal investigative agency that Ryan recognized by the specific way the agent held herself when she entered a room, the particular alert economy of motion that meant she was logging everything she saw from the moment she crossed the threshold. She introduced herself as Special Agent Dana Mercer, and she had the handshake of someone who doesn't think about their handshake because they have more important things to think about. Agent Mercer spoke to Ryan first. They stood near the pressurization system access panel, away from the main crowd of hangar personnel, and Ryan walked her through everything he'd found in the order he'd found it. The maintenance log irregularities, the physical valve adjustment, the certificate replacement, the deletion sequence, the administrative access logs, and finally the investment correspondence archive. He handed her the secondary drive. She handled it the way people handle things they understand to be important, which is carefully and without ceremony. Your background is flagged in our aviation safety records, Agent Mercer said when he'd finished. It wasn't a question. I did some work with the classified safety architecture program several years ago, Ryan said. Before I left to... He paused. Before I left. She looked at him briefly. The pause had been small, but she'd caught it, because that was her job. Before you left to raise your daughter, she said. Ryan looked at her. That's in the file too? The file is thorough, she said, without inflection. He didn't say anything to that. I wasn't sure what there was to say. His life for the past 4 years compressed into a government record, the specific shape of his choices visible to people who had clearance to look at them. It was a strange feeling, not entirely bad, not entirely comfortable. You made the right call tonight, Agent Mercer said. She said it simply, the way people say true things when they're not trying to make them land as more than they are. I made the call the situation required, Ryan said. Can we talk about the relay certificates? I flagged them for federal review rather than removing them myself because I didn't want to compromise the chain. That was correct, she said. Walk me through what you found. They spent 40 minutes on the technical details. Agent Mercer asked precise questions and took notes in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil, and she didn't ask Ryan to repeat himself once, which told him she was following the technical content in real time rather than collecting keywords to sort out later. That made the conversation faster and more useful than it might have been. At some point during those 40 minutes, the second federal safety officer took possession of Derek Vaughn's mobile device and laptop bag. Derek's lawyer objected in the specific, measured way that lawyers object to things they know they can't actually stop, formally, for the record, without genuine expectation of changing the outcome. Derek said nothing. Ryan noticed from across the room that Derek watched the laptop bag being sealed into an evidence container with the expression of a man watching the last piece of a plan he'd spent a year building get closed inside a zipper sub. At 2:23 a.m., Agent Mercer called Ryan back from the relay housing access bay where he'd been cross-checking the certificate documentation with the federal safety officer. We need to talk about the investment group, she said. They moved to the small office off the main hangar floor. A spare room with a folding table and 4 mismatched chairs and a wall-mounted whiteboard covered in what appeared to be logistical scheduling information that was now profoundly irrelevant to anyone's evening. Agent Mercer sat across from Ryan. Vanessa Sterling joined them a minute later and sat at the end of the table, which seemed about right. It was her company and her hangar and her 3 years of misplaced trust, and the conversation that was about to happen concerned all of those things. Carver Meridian Capital, Agent Mercer said. We know the name. Vanessa looked at her. They're not under investigation, to be clear, Agent Mercer said. But the fund's acquisition strategy is one that's come up in federal context before. A fund that specializes in distressed defense sector companies is a fund that, depending on how they identify their opportunities, can become relevant to federal interest in ways that go beyond the strictly financial. She paused. What we found in the correspondence archive on your network suggests that Vaughn's relationship with the fund was initiated by someone at the fund rather than by Vaughn himself. Someone recruited him, Vanessa said. That's what the earliest correspondence suggests, yes. We'll know more when we pull the full communication history from his devices. Agent Mercer looked at the table for a moment. Ms. Sterling, I want to be direct with you. What happened in this hangar tonight? The specific technical construction of the sabotage, the way it was designed to create a particular failure at a particular moment. This required someone with detailed knowledge of your aircraft's classified systems. Vaughn has operational knowledge, but his technical background doesn't fully account for the precision of what was built into that relay. The implication settled into the room quietly. You think there's someone else, Vanessa said. We think there may be a technical consultant involved who has not yet been identified, Agent Mercer said. That's not your problem to solve tonight. That's ours. But it means that what happened here is more than one disgruntled operations director with a financial motive. There's a structure behind it. Ryan had been listening to this exchange from his chair with the specific stillness of a man who is processing information and keeping his face clear of the processing. He'd had a version of this thought himself, standing in the relay housing earlier. The work was too precise for someone who was primarily an operations person. Operations people knew systems at the management level, at the process level. They didn't generally know classified certificate architecture at the implementation level. Someone had known. Someone had either taught Derek or done the technical work themselves. "Is this hangar secure right now?" Ryan asked. Agent Mercer looked at him. "We have the exits covered." "Why?" "Because if there's a technical person involved who isn't Derek and isn't in custody, and that person was either in this hangar tonight or has remote access to systems in this hangar, then the work I've been doing on the aircraft, the documentation, the correction of the valve, the flag certificates, all of that is visible on the maintenance network to anyone with the right access." A brief silence. "They'd know the sabotage was owned," Vanessa said. "They'd know everything I found and everything I documented," Ryan said. "And if they built a backup into the system, another layer, something triggered by detection of the primary sabotage being discovered rather than by flight conditions. I haven't found it yet because I wasn't looking for a second layer." Agent Mercer stood up from the table. "How long do you need to do a full secondary sweep?" Ryan looked at his watch. 2:31 a.m. 90 minutes minimum, probably 2 hours. "You have until 4, she said. "That's the outer edge of the flight window if we're going to salvage any part of the demonstration timeline." Ryan stood up. "Then I need to get back to the aircraft." "Ryan." Vanessa's voice stopped at him at the office door. He turned. She was looking at him from her chair at the end of the folding table, in a room that smelled like dry erase markers and old coffee, with the printed pages from Carver Meridian Capital's acquisition documents stacked near her elbow, and 3 years of misplaced trust somewhere in the room with them, taking up space the way certain things do when they've been named out loud. "I need to say something," Vanessa said. "You don't have to," Ryan said. He wasn't being polite. He genuinely didn't need it, and he genuinely didn't have the time. "I threatened your career," she said, "in front of your colleagues, because you looked like someone whose opinion I could dismiss." She held his gaze. "That was wrong. Not because you turned out to be right, because I did it at all." Ryan looked at her for a moment. The fluorescent light in the small office was the unflattering kind that showed everything. The tiredness around her eyes, the tension she was carrying in her jaw, the very specific expression of a person who is not asking for forgiveness because they're not sure they've earned it yet. "Okay," he said. It wasn't acceptance or dismissal. It was acknowledgement, the simplest form of it, the kind that doesn't wrap anything up or make anything easier, but recognizes that something real was just said. Then he went back to the aircraft. He found the second layer at 3:08 a.m. It was buried in the aircraft's primary flight management system, not in the communications relay, not in the pressurization system, but in the flight management system's authentication handshake protocol. A dormant script, nested 3 levels deep inside legitimate system code, designed not to trigger during flight, but to trigger specifically when the primary relay certificates were flagged for federal review, which Ryan had done at approximately 1:15 a.m. The script had been sitting dormant for the past hour and 45 minutes, counting down to a specific execution window. When it ran, it was designed to generate a falsified maintenance authorization record, time-stamped, credentialed, bearing all the right digital signatures, that would show Ryan Calder as the authorizing administrator for every system modification made to the aircraft in the past 18 hours. Not Derek Vaughn. Ryan Calder. Ryan sat very still in front of the flight management system terminal for approximately 10 seconds. 10 seconds of looking at a script that had been built specifically to identify him as the saboteur in the event that the primary sabotage was discovered. Whoever had built this had planned for the possibility of being caught, and their contingency plan in that event was Ryan. His hands were completely steady. He noted that as a fact, the way you note facts about your own physical state when you want to stay calibrated. His hands were steady, and his breathing was even, and he was aware that what he was looking at was the most dangerous thing in this hangar. Not the tampered pressurization valve, not the replaced certificates, not Derek Vaughn's 14 months of archived correspondence with a private equity fund. This script, if it ran, would take everything he'd done tonight and flip it inside out, and the document it generated would be technically indistinguishable from legitimate records to anyone who didn't know exactly what they were looking at. He had to take it apart without triggering it, and he had to do it in the next 47 minutes, before the execution window opened. Ryan exhaled once, long and slow. Then he reached for the flight management terminal and started working. Outside the hangar, the rain had finally stopped. The airfield was quiet in the way airfields get quiet in the deep hours before dawn. Not peaceful exactly, but suspended. Everything paused between what the night had been and what the morning was going to require. The aircraft sat on the hangar floor with its interior lights on, surrounded by federal agents and exhausted technicians, and a 30-year-old CEO who had not sat down in 4 hours. And inside the flight management system, a single man with a worn jacket and a dented toolbox was working against a clock that nobody in the room could see, but everyone was going to feel when it stopped. Ryan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it for 30 seconds, then took it out. A text from a number saved as home contact, his neighbor Margaret, who had a key and who Ryan called in for overnight coverage when the work went late. The text said, "Sophie asked for you around midnight. I told her you were working. She went back to sleep, okay? Don't worry." Ryan looked at the text for 1 second. His daughter's name in a text message, sitting inside a phone, inside a pocket, inside a hangar where everything had been going wrong for the last 3 hours, and was now, slowly, being made right. He put the phone back in his pocket and returned to the flight management terminal. He had 43 minutes. He got to work. The flight management terminal had a particular smell, warm electronics and something faintly chemical from the cooling system. And Ryan had been close enough to it for long enough that he'd stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing. He was operating now in the specific narrowed state that came from high-stakes technical work with a real clock attached to it, where the peripheral details of the room fell away, and what remained was just the problem in front of you and the tools you had to address it. The dormant script was elegant in a way that Ryan genuinely did not want to admire, but couldn't entirely help noticing. Whoever had written it understood not just the flight management system's architecture, but the specific way federal safety investigations worked. They knew that a discovery of primary sabotage would trigger a federal review, that the review would involve flagging the relay certificates, and that the flagging process would generate a specific type of network event that could be used as a trigger. Building a secondary layer that activated on detection rather than on flight conditions was not standard sabotage thinking. It was the thinking of someone who had been in federal investigation rooms before, either as a subject or as a participant, and had come away with a very precise understanding of what the process looked like from the inside. Ryan mapped the script's execution pathway first, before touching anything else. This was the part where most people would have started pulling threads immediately, the pressure of the countdown making patience feel like a luxury. Ryan had learned in 4 years of classified safety work, and then 4 years of everything else, that the most expensive mistakes were the ones made in the first 30 seconds of trying to fix something you didn't yet fully understand. He gave himself 6 minutes to map it completely. 6 minutes of reading the code structure, tracing the trigger logic, identifying the output pathway that would generate the falsified authorization record. At the end of 6 minutes, he understood exactly what it did and exactly how it would have done it. He had 37 minutes left. The difficulty wasn't removing the script. Ryan could have removed it cleanly in 15 minutes under normal circumstances. The difficulty was that the script was nested inside legitimate system code in a way that meant any standard removal approach would generate a modification flag in the flight management system's own integrity log. A modification flag at 3 a.m., while the aircraft was under federal safety review, would look exactly like what it wasn't, like someone trying to alter the aircraft's systems records after the investigation had begun. The integrity log was automatically transmitted to the Federal Aviation Safety Network. The flag would appear on Agent Mercer's systems before Ryan could explain it. If that happened, the falsified record the script was designed to create would suddenly have corroborating context. A suspicious modification to the flight management system, logged automatically, made by the only person with current physical access to the terminal. The script was designed to be dangerous, whether it ran or whether someone tried to stop it. Ryan stared at the screen for approximately 4 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and called Agent Mercer. She answered on the second ring, which told him she was still awake and sharp, which at 3 a.m. after the night this had been, was its own kind of information about the person. I found a secondary layer in the flight management system, Ryan said. It's a dormant script set to execute in 36 minutes. When it runs, it generates a falsified maintenance authorization record identifying me as the administrator of every system modification made to this aircraft in the last 18 hours. I can remove it, but the removal will generate an integrity flag that transmits automatically to the Federal Aviation Network and will look, without context, like I'm modifying flight management records during an active investigation. A pause on the line. Brief. You need the flag suppressed, Agent Mercer said. I need you to put a notation on the federal system in the next 5 minutes saying that authorized remediation work is being conducted on the flight management system under federal supervision so that when the flag appears it has context attached to it. Can you send me the script's location in the system architecture? Ryan read her the pathway. He heard her typing. Give me 3 minutes, she said. I have 36, Ryan said, but the removal itself takes about 15, so I'd rather start with margin. She'd already put him on hold. He could hear background voices, another agent, the sounds of a federal system being accessed with the particular efficiency of people who were awake and working at 3 a.m. because the situation required it, not because anyone had asked them nicely. Ryan waited. He looked at the script on the screen. He thought, briefly and involuntarily, about the text from Margaret. Sophie asked for you around midnight. And then he put that thought somewhere else because it wasn't useful to him right now. And Sophie was asleep and fine, and the situation in front of him required all of his attention. Agent Mercer came back on the line in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The notation is in the system. You're clear to proceed. I'm also sending the second safety officer to your position to serve as a federal witness to the remediation. That'll take time. He's already walking toward you, she said. He was standing 12 feet from the aircraft. Ryan looked up. The second federal safety officer, a compact, quiet man named Garrison, who had said approximately 6 words since arriving at the hangar and seemed to operate primarily through precise, economical observation, was indeed walking toward the flight management terminal with the measured pace of someone who had been told where to go and was going there without unnecessary drama. Ryan appreciated that about him. Okay, Ryan told Agent Mercer. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, she said. The script's trigger window opens in 33 minutes. Let me know when it's clear. She ended the call. Officer Garrison stood 3 feet to Ryan's left and slightly behind him, close enough to observe the screen clearly, far enough not to crowd the work. He had a small federal issue recorder running on the equipment cart beside them, documenting the remediation in real time. Neither of them spoke for the first 8 minutes of the process, which suited Ryan perfectly. The removal required working through the script's nesting structure in reverse order, dismantling the outermost logic first, moving inward, being careful at each layer not to trigger the execution logic before the trigger pathway itself was isolated and cut. It was delicate in the way that technically difficult things are delicate, which is not the dramatic, trembling kind of delicate from films, but the focused, quiet kind that looks from the outside like a man simply typing at a keyboard and looks from the inside like walking a very specific line where the cost of stepping off it is concrete and immediate. At the 14-minute mark, Ryan isolated the trigger pathway. At 17 minutes, he cut it. At 19 minutes, he removed the script body entirely, cleaned the nested code back to its original structure, and generated a documented restoration record that Officer Garrison co-signed on the federal recorder. The integrity flag appeared in the system log at 3:28 a.m., right on schedule, and carried with it Agent Mercer's notation explaining exactly what it was and who had authorized it. Back from the terminal. His shoulders ached. He hadn't noticed them aching until just this moment, when the sustained tension of the last 20 minutes released all at once and left behind the specific soreness of a body that had been held very still under a lot of pressure. He rolled his neck once, felt it pop in 2 places, and stood up. Clear? Officer Garrison asked, first full word he'd said in half an hour. Clear, Ryan said. Garrison spoke quietly into his recorder, noting the time and the successful completion of the remediation. Then he looked at Ryan with the expression of a man who had been watching people work at high stakes for a long time and had developed a fairly accurate read on when the work was actually done versus when someone was telling themselves it was done. You good? Garrison asked. It was such a plain, direct question that Ryan almost didn't know what to do with it for a second. Yeah, he said, I'm good. He wasn't entirely sure that was true, but it was true enough to be useful, and right now useful was what the situation needed. The hangar had reorganized itself again in the time Ryan had been at the flight management terminal. The configuration of people and purpose that had defined the space at midnight, the pre-flight energy, the suited lawyers calculating their billing rates, the fueling technician with his safety vest and earphones, had given way to something more spare and deliberate. Most of the non-essential personnel had been asked to wait in the adjacent briefing room. What remained on the hangar floor was the core of the situation: federal agents, the aircraft, Claire at her laptop, and Vanessa Sterling, who was standing near the nose of the Gulf Stream with a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago, still held in her hand the way people hold things when they've forgotten they're holding them. Derek Vaughn had been moved to the briefing room. His lawyer had gone with him. The laptop bag and mobile device were in federal custody. The evidence Ryan had pulled from the maintenance network was documented, copied, and transmitted. The archive from the compressed file Claire had found, the acquisition correspondence, the term sheets, the projected buy-in price of a company Vanessa Sterling had built out of nothing, was being reviewed by federal financial investigators who had been called in from a field office 40 minutes east. The physical threat to the aircraft had been addressed. The digital threat had been addressed. The falsified record that would have landed on Ryan's name had been removed before it could execute. What was left now was the aircraft itself. Ryan walked to where Vanessa was standing. She heard him coming and looked over. Her eyes were tired, but not the exhausted, falling apart kind of tired, but the clean bottom kind that comes at the end of a long night when the adrenaline has metabolized and what's left is just the actual condition of a human body that has been awake for 22 hours under sustained stress. She looked like herself, in other words, but a version of herself that had been put through something and was currently on the other side of it. The flight management system is clear, Ryan said. I found a secondary layer, a script designed to identify me as the saboteur if the primary layer was discovered. It's been removed and documented under federal supervision. Vanessa looked at him for a moment. They built in a contingency to frame you. Yes. If we'd caught it differently, if someone else had found it, someone who didn't know what they were looking at, then the falsified record would have appeared to show me as the person who authorized every modification to this aircraft, Ryan said. And I would have been the story instead of Derek. Vanessa absorbed that. The implications of it were not small. The specific cruelty of building a trap that used the person most likely to find your sabotage as the designated scapegoat for it. A trap that only activated when someone smart enough to find the primary problem was smart enough to look for the secondary one. It was constructed to work best against exactly the kind of thorough, careful investigation that Ryan had conducted. Is the aircraft safe to fly? Vanessa asked. It was the question everything tonight had been building toward, and Ryan had been doing the inventory of his own answer for the last 40 minutes. The pressurization valve is corrected and documented, he said. The relay certificates need to be replaced with verified originals by a federal credentialed technician. I flagged them but didn't replace them myself because that required federal authorization. Once the certificates are replaced and verified, and once the federal safety officers complete their own independent inspection of the systems I've worked on, then yes, I believe the aircraft can be cleared for the demonstration flight. How long for all of that? Ryan checked his watch. 3:41 a.m. If the federal technician starts on the certificates now, and if their independent inspection runs concurrent rather than sequential with the certificate work, you're looking at 90 minutes minimum, probably closer to 2 hours. Vanessa did the math openly on her face. The demonstration window was not infinitely flexible. There were Pentagon schedules, arrival windows, logistics that existed independent of what had happened in this hangar tonight. But the federal contacts she'd been speaking to all night had communicated, in the careful language of official channels, that the discovery of a sabotage operation against a classified defense system had generated a certain amount of institutional interest in making sure the demonstration still happened. When the federal government has a stake in something working, the scheduling conversations tend to go differently than when they don't. Agent Mercer told me an hour ago that the demonstration window can be extended to 0700 if we can certify the aircraft by 0545, Vanessa said. Is 0545 realistic? Ryan did his own math. It's tight, but realistic. What do you need? I need your federal technician, whoever they're bringing in for the certificate work, to start immediately. And I need to stay on the aircraft through the independent inspection. Not to conduct it, but to be available to answer questions. I know this system better right now than anyone else who's going to be in this room for the next 2 hours. And every time someone has a question and has to track me down to ask it, that's 5 minutes. Done, Vanessa said. She turned toward Agent Mercer, who was crossing the hangar floor toward them with the purposeful walk of someone who had been watching the conversation from across the room and had timed her approach correctly. Certificate replacement? Vanessa said to her. Federal technician is en route, Agent Mercer said. ETA 18 minutes. She'll need Ryan's documentation on the original certificate parameters. Already compiled, Ryan said. He pulled a printed summary from his clipboard, 4 pages, organized in the order the technician would need them, because Ryan had put them together that way 40 minutes ago against the possibility that this conversation would happen. He handed them to Agent Mercer. She looked at the pages briefly. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation. You put this together before you knew the certificate replacement was approved. I put it together because it was going to be needed either way, Ryan said. Agent Mercer looked at him for 1 second. Then she took the pages and walked toward the relay housing. The next 90 minutes were the particular kind of organized chaos that happens when multiple high-stakes processes are running simultaneously in a shared physical space, and everyone involved is tired and focused and working to their own timeline that has to somehow synchronize with everyone else's. The federal technician, a woman named Park, who arrived at 3:59 a.m. in civilian clothes with a federal credentials case and a toolkit that was newer and more expensive than Ryan's but no better organized, moved directly to the relay housing and began the certificate replacement work without preamble. Ryan stood near the access bay and answered her questions when she had them, which was 3 times in the first 20 minutes, and then not at all, because Park was fast and thorough and did not need her hand held through work she knew how to do. Officer Garrison and the second federal safety inspector conducted their independent inspection of the pressurization system concurrently, working from Ryan's documentation and their own protocol checklists, occasionally asking Ryan to confirm a reading or clarify a notation. Ryan confirmed and clarified and stayed out of their way between queries. Claire had been joined by 2 federal financial investigators at her laptop station, working through the investment correspondence archive with the systematic, unhurried attention of people who were building a case rather than responding to a crisis. They had the slightly different energy of the financial investigation world, more methodical, less physical environment aware than the aviation safety people. And they periodically asked Claire questions about the network architecture that she answered with the straightforward competence of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the scope of what she'd found in her own company's servers. Vanessa moved through all of these stations without staying at any one of them long enough to disrupt the work. She checked in, listened, moved on. She asked precise questions and received answers and integrated them. She was doing what good executives do in crisis situations, which is not to manage the crisis directly, but to manage the conditions around the people who are managing the crisis, keeping the lanes clear and the resources available and the decisions that need making made quickly enough that they don't become obstacles. At 4:47 a.m., Park completed the certificate replacement and called Ryan over to verify the work. Ryan went through the certificates carefully, comparing them against the original parameters from his documentation, checking the authentication chains, verifying the embedded parameters. Park stood beside him with the particular patience of a skilled technician who knows their work is good and is waiting for someone else to confirm it without being defensive about the confirmation process. "These are correct," Ryan said. "I know," Park said. "Not arrogant, just accurate." Ryan appreciated it. He signed the verification record. Park co-signed. Officer Garrison, who had materialized at Ryan's shoulder somewhere in the last 3 minutes in the way he had of appearing near important moments without seeming to move toward them, witnessed both signatures and logged the time. The relay was clean. At 5:09 a.m., the independent inspection of the pressurization system was completed and signed off by both federal safety officers. The valve correction was confirmed. The system read within normal parameters across the full range of calibration checks. Ryan stood in the middle of the hangar floor and looked at the aircraft. He had been in this building for 5 hours and 22 minutes. In that time, he had found a tampered valve, falsified maintenance records, replaced authentication certificates, a remote deletion attempt, 14 months of documented conspiracy, a dormant framing script, and the fingerprints of an unnamed technical consultant who had built a sabotage operation elegant enough to pass every standard inspection and destroy a company on schedule. The aircraft was clean now. Every system he'd touched was documented, verified, countersigned by federal witnesses, and logged in a chain that couldn't be questioned. He was tired. Not dramatically tired. He wasn't swaying on his feet or losing coherence. Just the quiet, bone-level tiredness of a man who had spent 5 hours doing difficult, precise work in a high-stakes environment after a full workday before it, and who had a 6-year-old daughter who was going to want pancakes in approximately 3 hours whether or not her father had slept. Ryan walked to his toolbox. He began putting his tools away in their proper places. Not quickly, not slowly, just methodically, the way you put things away when you want them to be findable the next time you need them. He heard footsteps behind him. More than one set. He turned around. Vanessa Sterling was walking toward him across the hangar floor. Behind her were the 2 federal safety officers, Agent Mercer, Park, Claire, and approximately half the personnel who had been present at midnight. Mechanics, technicians, the hangar's operations staff. Most of them looking like people who had been awake for too long and had seen more in one night than they'd expected to see. Vanessa stopped in front of him. Ryan looked at her. "Federal inspection is complete," he said. "Both systems cleared. You should be able to begin final pre-flight sequencing in time for the 0545 certification window." "I know," Vanessa said. "Agent Mercer briefed me." "Then, I'm not here to talk about the aircraft right now," Vanessa said. Something in her voice had changed. Not the CEO voice, not the controlled crisis management voice he'd been hearing all night. Something underneath both of those. The layer that exists in people before they learn to lead rooms and manage boards and make decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The layer that's just a person who has been through something and is standing on the other side of it. "Earlier tonight," she said, "in front of every person in this hangar, I told you that if you touched my aircraft again, you were finished. I told you I would make sure every aviation services firm in the Mid-Atlantic knew your name." The hangar was very quiet. The kind of quiet that has a specific texture, not empty, but held. "You were doing your job," Vanessa said. "You were doing it better than anyone I've ever brought into this building, and I responded by threatening your livelihood in front of your colleagues because you looked like someone whose opinion I could override." She paused. Not for effect, for accuracy, because she was trying to say something precisely and she was making sure she was saying it right. "I was wrong. Not wrong because you turned out to have a federal safety background. Not wrong because the Pentagon called. Wrong when I said it. I should have listened earlier, and I didn't. And I want to say that plainly and in front of the same people who heard me say the other thing." Ryan looked at her. He looked at the room behind her, the people who had watched him get dressed down at midnight, who had watched security move toward him, who had watched the billionaire in the gray blazer tell a contract technician in a worn jacket that he was finished. The same people who had then watched the next 5 hours happen. He didn't feel triumphant. That surprised him slightly, in the abstract way you notice things about yourself at 5 a.m. when your defenses are low. He thought he might feel something like vindication, or at least relief, but what he actually felt was closer to tired and slightly uncomfortable and a little uncertain about what the right thing to say was. "Okay," he said, which was what he'd said earlier in the small office, and it still felt like the right answer. Not dismissive, not magnanimous, just honest. What had happened, and she'd named it correctly, and there wasn't a better word for that than okay. Vanessa held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I'd like to offer you a position, not a contract, a full position. Director of Independent Safety Operations, overseeing all flight systems verification for Sterling Aeronautics Defense Division. Your own team, your own procedures, full authority to ground any aircraft at any time without requiring approval from operations management." Ryan looked at her. "That's a significant position." "Yes." "You'd be creating it specifically because your operations director turned out to be running a sabotage operation financed by a private equity fund." "I'd be creating it," Vanessa said, "because tonight proved that I had a gap in my organization between the people who know what they're doing and the people who are authorized to act on what they know, and that gap nearly destroyed everything I've built. I don't want that gap anymore." Ryan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the aircraft, then at his toolbox, half-packed, sitting on the hangar floor. I have conditions, he said. Something shifted in Vanessa's expression. Not surprise, more like a specific kind of attention that she probably gave to negotiations she considered worth having. Tell me. Full written authority to ground any aircraft under Sterling Aeronautics operations with no requirement for executive approval. Not guidance. Authority. Documented in my employment agreement. Yes. Independent reporting structure. My safety findings go directly to federal compliance channels, not through your board or your legal team first. Vanessa hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then, yes. My schedule, Ryan said. I have a 6-year-old daughter. I am not available before 7:30 a.m. on school days, and I am not available after 5:30 p.m. on any day that doesn't involve an active safety emergency. Travel requirements get discussed before they're confirmed, not after. And if there is ever a genuine emergency, a real one, not a deadline, not a contract window, not a demonstration, I have a right to factor my daughter's needs into how I respond to it. The room was quiet. Vanessa looked at him for a moment. You've thought about this, she said. I've thought about what I'd need to do this kind of work without doing it the way I left it the last time, Ryan said. It was more than he'd intended to say, and he knew it, and he said it anyway because it was true, and the night had already used up most of his instinct for strategic self-presentation. Vanessa nodded, slow, definite. Those are reasonable conditions, she said. All of them. Then I'll consider it, Ryan said. Not yes yet. I want to see it in writing, and I want my own legal review of the employment agreement. Agent Mercer, standing 6 feet back and to the left, made a sound that might have been an almost laugh, suppressed immediately into professionalism. Vanessa almost smiled. It was the first time all night that anything approaching a smile had appeared on her face, and it had the quality of something involuntary. Not performed, just arrived. Fair enough, she said. Get it to you by Monday. Ryan nodded. Then he picked up his toolbox and finished packing it, because the tools still needed to be put away correctly, and that job didn't complete itself while you were having other conversations. At 5:38 a.m., Sterling Aeronautics Gulfstream G700 was cleared for flight by federal safety certification. The fueling sequence, the one Ryan had halted 6 hours earlier, was restarted under new authorization. The fuel coupling unlocked cleanly, the way things unlock when they've been secured correctly and are now being released correctly. The ground crew moved back into their positions with the careful efficiency of people who understood that the night had been unusual and that the work now required was the ordinary, essential work that followed unusual nights. Ryan stood near the hangar's side door and watched the fueling sequence complete. His toolbox was in his hand. His inspection badge was still clipped to his jacket. His truck was in the contractor parking lot on the north side of the building, and his daughter was asleep 40 minutes north of here in a house where his neighbor Margaret was keeping watch. And the drive home was going to take him past exactly one gas station, and he was going to stop and get the largest coffee they had available, and he was going to drink it in the parking lot for about 3 minutes before he got back in the truck, because he needed 3 minutes of sitting in a quiet car before he was ready to be a person in the world again. Derek Vaughn was in federal custody. His devices were in evidence. His 14 months of correspondence with Carver Meridian Capital was in the hands of investigators who were very good at following paper trails to wherever they led. The unnamed technical consultant who had built the relay certificates and the framing script and the secondary trigger system was not yet in custody, but the evidence trail from this night would reach them. Ryan had enough experience to know how these things went. They went slowly, and then all at once, and the person at the end of the trail always seemed surprised when the trail arrived, even when they had known for a long time that it was coming. Vanessa Sterling walked across the hangar floor one last time and stopped beside Ryan at the side door. They stood there for a moment, not quite side by side. She was slightly in front of him, looking at the aircraft, and he was at the door with his toolbox, looking mostly at the door and partly at the aircraft and partly at nothing in particular. It flies because of what you did tonight, Vanessa said. Ryan didn't say anything. I don't mean that as a compliment, she said. I mean it as a fact. The aircraft is in the air today because you were in this building. The aircraft is in the air today because someone tried to make it a weapon and didn't succeed, Ryan said. That's the accurate version. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. You're not very comfortable with gratitude. I'm comfortable with it, Ryan said. I'm just not sure what to do with it at 5:45 in the morning after a night like this. That almost smile is again. Go home, she said. Get some sleep. Be with your daughter. That's the plan, Ryan said. He pushed the side door open. The airfield hit him immediately. Cool air, the particular pre-dawn smell of wet tarmac and open space that had no name but that anyone who had ever been outside just before sunrise in a place with no trees nearby would recognize immediately. The rain was long gone. The sky to the east had that specific quality of dark that comes just before dark starts to change. Not lighter yet, just different. The announcement of what was coming rather than the thing itself. Ryan walked to his truck. He put the toolbox in the bed, got in the cab, started the engine, and sat there for a moment with his hands on the wheel. His phone had 3 missed calls, 2 from the Altitude Technical Services dispatch line, probably triggered by the federal safety hold notice that had gone through their system, and 1 from a number he didn't recognize that he would deal with later. A work problem for the next day or the day after, and he had enough of those already without borrowing new ones at 5:45 a.m. He pulled up Margaret's number and typed, "On my way home. Be there in 45. Thank you." Her reply came back in 40 seconds. "Sophie drew you a picture of an airplane. She's very proud of it. Drive safe." Ryan looked at that for a moment. Then he put the phone in the cup holder and pulled out of the contractor parking lot onto the airfield access road. Behind him, through the rearview mirror, the Sterling Aeronautics hangar was lit up against the pre-dawn dark. The Gulfstream G700 was visible through the open hangar doors, fueled and certified and cleared, surrounded by people who were doing their jobs correctly because someone had insisted on doing his. Ryan drove north toward the highway, toward coffee, toward home, toward a 6-year-old girl who had asked for him at midnight and drawn him an airplane and gone back to sleep. Not knowing that her father had spent the night making sure that a different airplane didn't fall out of the sky. The sky to the east began very slowly to change. The coffee from the gas station was bad, in the specific way that gas station coffee is bad at 6 in the morning. Too hot, slightly burnt, tasting like the pot had been sitting since the previous shift, and nobody had decided yet whose job it was to make a fresh one. Ryan drank half of it in the parking lot, as planned, sitting in the cab of his truck with the engine idling and the heater running low and the radio off. 3 minutes of quiet. Maybe 4. He wasn't counting. The sky was doing the thing it does in that window between 5 and 6 a.m. in Virginia in the early fall, turning from the specific dark blue that precedes dawn into something lighter and more complicated. The horizon going gray-orange in the east in a way that was neither beautiful nor ugly, but simply true. It was happening whether he watched it or not. He watched it anyway. He thought about Sophie's airplane drawing. He thought about it the way you think about something small and specific, when you've just come through something large and complicated, holding it up against everything else the night had contained and finding that it didn't diminish anything and wasn't diminished by anything. A drawing of an airplane by a 6-year-old. Crayon, probably. Likely with disproportionate wings and a sun in the corner and his name spelled correctly because Sophie was meticulous about spelling even when she got the letters slightly backwards, which she did less often now than she had 6 months ago. She was getting older. She kept doing that. Ryan finished the coffee, put the truck in gear, and drove north. The highway was sparse at this hour. Long-haul trucks, a few early commuters, the occasional vehicle moving with the particular purposefulness of someone who has somewhere to be before the world fully wakes up. Ryan drove at a steady pace, not fast, not slow, with the specific kind of attention that tired people give to driving when they are aware of being tired and are compensating for it deliberately rather than pretending it isn't there. He thought about Vanessa Sterling's offer, the way you think about something significant that you're not ready to fully think about yet, circling it, noting its edges, leaving the center of it for later. Director of Independent Safety Operations. Full authority to ground aircraft. His own procedures, his own team, a reporting structure that went directly to federal compliance rather than through a board or a legal filter. The conditions she'd accepted without negotiating, the hours, Sophie's schedule, the right to factor his daughter into how he responded to emergencies. The last time Ryan had done this kind of work, he'd done it inside a system that didn't negotiate those things. That system had specific logic to it. There were reasons why classified aviation safety operations didn't accommodate school pickup schedules, and Ryan had understood those reasons and accepted them until the morning he'd stood in a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m. because Sophie had an ear infection and there was nobody else to stand there, and he'd looked at his phone and seen 3 pending work notifications and felt something clarify inside him with the specific, irreversible quality of a decision that has already been made before you consciously made it. He'd left 2 months after that. Not bitterly, not with grievance, just with the understanding that there was a version of his life that was available to him, and a version that wasn't, and that the version containing Sophie required him to stand somewhere different. 4 years of contract work. Secondary inspection assignments, maintenance verification, the kind of work that uses a fraction of what you know and pays a fraction of what that knowledge is worth, but lets you be home by 6 and coaches t-ball on Saturdays and makes breakfast on school days and is there when the ear infections happen. 4 years of being the man nobody saw coming because he'd made himself invisible to the world that used to know his name. And then one stormy night in Virginia, a Billionaire's aircraft with a tampered pressurization valve and a rebuilt radio that wanted to lie to the Pentagon. Ryan had not planned for tonight. He had arrived at that hangar as a secondary contract inspector, expecting to spend 2 hours confirming that everything was fine and driving home. The thing that had happened instead was not something he'd engineered or sought or positioned himself for. He'd just been in the room, and he'd been paying attention, and he'd known what he was looking at when he saw it. That was the whole of it, stripped of everything else. He pulled onto his street at 6:33 a.m. The neighborhood was beginning to stir in the quiet, undramatic way neighborhoods stir at this hour. A light on in a kitchen here, a dog-walking figure at the far end of the block there, a car backing out of a driveway 2 houses down. His house was a mid-sized colonial, white with green shutters, bought 3 years ago with the specific calculation of a single parent trying to be in a good school district while also not paying more mortgage than the contract work reliably supported. The gutters needed cleaning. He'd noticed that last weekend and hadn't gotten to it. He was noticing it again now because it was the kind of thing you notice when you come home from something large and are returning to the ordinary details of your actual life. He parked, got out, retrieved his toolbox from the truck bed, and let himself in through the side door. Margaret was asleep on the couch under the guest blanket with her reading glasses still on her face, which was such a specific and familiar sight. She did this every time, fell asleep reading and woke up confused about the glasses. That Ryan felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't fully known was tight. He set the toolbox down quietly, took the glasses off her face, folded them on the coffee table, and went upstairs. Sophie's door was half open. He pushed it the rest of the way, slowly, and looked in. She was asleep on her side with one arm hanging off the bed in the way she'd slept since she was 3 years old, always threatening to fall off, never falling off, defying gravity with the comfortable certainty of someone who has never actually fallen. Her hair was across her face. She was breathing with the deep, uncomplicated rhythm of a child who went to sleep without worrying about staying asleep. On the nightstand, propped against her lamp, was the drawing. Ryan picked it up carefully. It was a Gulfstream-shaped thing in blue crayon, somewhat ambitious in scope. She'd attempted to draw it from a 3/4 angle rather than straight on, which had resulted in a fuselage that was slightly oval and wings at slightly different heights, and there was a pilot in the cockpit window who was a circle with 2 dots and a curved line. At the bottom, in her careful, slightly backwards letters, "Dad, fix our plans." He stood there holding that drawing for a moment. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like anything cinematic. He felt like a 32-year-old man who was very tired and whose lower back hurt, and who was holding a crayon drawing in a child's bedroom at 6:40 in the morning, and who had approximately 90 minutes before his daughter woke up and wanted pancakes, and who had somewhere between tonight and Monday to decide whether to accept a job that would change the shape of his life in ways he couldn't entirely map yet. He set the drawing back against the lamp exactly as he'd found it. Then he went to his own room, sat on the edge of the bed, and was asleep in less than 4 minutes. He slept for 3 hours and 40 minutes, which was not enough, and was also exactly what he got, because Sophie came in at 10:23 a.m. and stood at the side of his bed and said, "Dad," in the specific tone she used when she had decided that waiting was no longer a reasonable option. "Hey," Ryan said into the pillow. "You're home," Sophie said. This was stated as fact, with the mild satisfaction of a person whose prediction has been confirmed. "Yeah." He rolled over. She was already dressed, jeans, a yellow shirt, her hair in a ponytail that was somewhat off-center, which meant she'd done it herself. She was 6. She'd been doing her own ponytail for 4 months. It was almost never centered. Morning, Bug. It's not morning, she said. It's almost lunch. It's 10:23. That's almost lunch. Ryan sat up. His back hurt and his eyes felt like they'd been used more than usual, which was accurate. Sophie climbed onto the bed beside him and leaned against his arm with the unceremonious comfort of a child who has never had to earn her place in her father's space. Margaret said you worked all night, she said. I did. Did you fix airplanes? Ryan thought about the pressurization valve, the authentication certificates, the dormant script sitting in the flight management system, counting down. Yeah, he said, something like that. Sophie considered this with the evaluative seriousness she brought to most things. I drew you one. I saw it. It's really good. The wings are different sizes, she said, without apparent distress. I know. I was going to fix it, but then I got tired. I think the different sizes are what makes it interesting, Ryan said. Sophie looked at him with the expression she used when she suspected she was being managed. She was 6, and she already had that look. Ryan wasn't sure whether to be worried or proud. That's what you say when something's not right, but you don't want to say it's not right, she said. Sometimes, Ryan said, this time I actually mean it. She seemed to accept this. She leaned against him again. Are you going to make pancakes? Yeah. Can I have the ones with the blueberries in them? Do we have blueberries? She thought about this. I don't know. Margaret might have used them. Ryan stood up, found his footing, found his way to vertical. Let's go check. They had blueberries. Margaret had not used them. She was awake by the time Ryan got downstairs, reading at the kitchen table with her actual coffee and her actual glasses, and she looked at Ryan over the top of the cup with the expression of a woman who had known him for 3 years and could read his condition fairly accurately on sight. You look like you slept on a runway, she said. I slept fine, Ryan said, opening the refrigerator. For about 4 hours by my count. She took a sip of her coffee. Everything okay? Everything's okay, Ryan said. He meant it. It was a more complicated okay than it might have sounded, with more inside it than was worth explaining before breakfast, but it was okay in the real sense of the word rather than the evasive sense. Thank you for last night, Margaret. She waved this off with the specific gesture of someone who has been told thank you for something they consider simply part of how things work. She was fine. Slept through after midnight. She stood up, gathered her things, paused on her way to the door. There were some calls on your work phone this morning. I didn't answer, but they called 3 times. I know, Ryan said. I'll deal with it. She nodded, said goodbye to Sophie, who was already pulling the stool to the counter to help with the pancakes, in the way that meant she intended to be involved in every step regardless of whether the pancakes would benefit from this, and let herself out the side door. Ryan made pancakes with blueberries. Sophie helped in the way 6-year-olds help, which is by adding slightly too many blueberries and stirring the batter past the point of optimal texture and being genuinely delighted by the whole process. The pancakes came out fine. They were not the best pancakes Ryan had ever made, but they were hot and real, and they sat at the kitchen table and ate them together, and outside the window the Saturday morning was doing what Saturday mornings did, slow and unhurried, and lit with the kind of ordinary light that doesn't ask anything of you. Sophie ate 4 pancakes, which was a lot for a 6-year-old, and Ryan ate 2, which was not enough for a man who hadn't eaten since lunch the previous day, but was all he could manage before his appetite gave out. Dad? Sophie said, with a blueberry on her lip that she hadn't noticed. Yeah. Are you going to work tonight? No, Ryan said. Not tonight. Are you going to work a lot now? He looked at her. The question was the kind that comes from a child who has been paying attention to things for longer than you realized they were paying attention. What makes you ask that? Sophie shrugged, the elaborate full-body shrug of a child who hasn't yet learned to make shrugs look casual. You were gone all night, and you got a lot of calls. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He thought about how to answer this in a way that was honest and also appropriate for a 6-year-old, and also not a promise he'd have to break later because Sophie remembered promises with the specific perfect accuracy of children and the specific legitimate grievance of people who have learned to rely on the ones that get kept. I might have a different kind of job soon, he said. A bigger one, with better hours. Sophie looked at him. Better means you're home more? Better means I have more say in when I'm home and when I'm not. That's better, she confirmed, with the authority of someone who had been thinking about this metric for some time. Yeah, Ryan said. That's better. The work calls turned out to be three things. Two from the Altitude Technical Services dispatch manager, a man named Harold, who was professionally agitated in the way that people who run contract services firms become professionally agitated when one of their technicians triggers a federal safety hold on a billion-dollar aircraft, and Harold hasn't been briefed yet on what happened. And one from a number Ryan didn't recognize that turned out, when he called it back that afternoon, to be a junior legal coordinator at Sterling Aeronautics calling to confirm Ryan's email address so they could send the draft employment agreement. The draft arrived at 4:17 p.m. on Saturday. Ryan read it that evening after Sophie was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with his second coffee of the day, going through it the way he went through any technical document, carefully, linearly, not skipping sections because they looked administrative. The agreement was 22 pages. He read all 22. Some of it was standard employment language that meant nothing except that the lawyers had done their jobs. Some of it was specific. The authority clause was real, not guidance, not recommendation authority. Full operational authority to ground any Sterling Aeronautics aircraft for any documented safety reason, with a federal compliance reporting pathway that bypassed the executive structure entirely. He read that section 3 times. The schedule provisions were real too. The language was specific in a way that suggested someone had told the legal team exactly what it needed to say, rather than letting them draft it generically. School day availability windows, advance notice requirements for travel, the explicit right to prioritize family emergency response. It was the kind of employment language that didn't exist in most companies because most companies didn't think to write it, and the people who needed it didn't have enough leverage to ask for it. Ryan had asked for it, and Vanessa Sterling had said yes, and now it was in a legal document on page 14, paragraph 3, with specific definitions and enforcement language. He sent it to his brother-in-law, who was an attorney in Richmond, and who would give him an honest read without charging him for it because that was the kind of relationship they had. Built over 9 years of family dinners and a shared interest in college football, and the specific mutual respect of two people who had watched each other do difficult things reasonably well. His brother-in-law called him Sunday morning. "This is a real document," he said, which was attorney speak for, "I was looking for problems and didn't find the ones I expected." The authority clause is unusual. Most companies don't give safety officers this kind of operational independence. "I know," Ryan said. "The schedule language is also unusual." "I know." A pause. "You want my honest opinion? That's why I sent it to you." "Sign it," his brother-in-law said. "Ask them to clarify the indemnification language in paragraph 19, because it's ambiguous in a way that probably isn't intentional but could matter. Otherwise, sign it." Ryan asked them to clarify paragraph 19. The clarification came back Monday morning, clean and specific. He signed the agreement Monday afternoon. Derek Vaughn was formally charged on a Tuesday, 11 days after the night in the hangar. The charges were federal: conspiracy to commit sabotage of a defense system, fraudulent alteration of federal maintenance records, computer fraud, and a financial crimes charge related to his arrangement with Carver Meridian Capital that Ryan didn't fully understand, but that the news coverage described as a form of securities fraud predicated on material non-public information. His lawyer entered a not guilty plea. The case would take time. These things always took time. The unnamed technical consultant, the person who had built the relay certificates and the framing script, the person whose fingerprints existed in the code but not yet in custody, was identified 2 weeks after that. Agent Mercer called Ryan on a Wednesday morning while he was driving Sophie to school and told him briefly and without detail that they had a name and were in the process of executing an arrest. Ryan thanked her and ended the call and dropped Sophie off at the curb outside her school and watched her run toward the entrance with her backpack bouncing and her ponytail slightly off-center as always. He didn't find out the technical consultant's name until it appeared in federal charging documents 3 days later, and when he saw it, he recognized it. A former colleague from his classified work years, someone he'd crossed professional paths with twice, someone whose technical capability he'd respected, and whose name he'd have never associated with something like this. It was the specific kind of surprise that isn't entirely a surprise, the kind where you can trace backwards and see the shape of someone's choices leading to where they arrived, even if you couldn't have predicted the destination from where you'd stood alongside them years ago. People made choices. The choices accumulated into lives. Sometimes the lives turned out to contain things you wouldn't have predicted from the outside. Ryan had thought about that a lot in the weeks since the hangar. Not about Derek or the technical consultant specifically, about the general fact of it, about how you couldn't always read a person's trajectory from their visible surface, about how Vanessa Sterling had read his visible surface, worn jacket, old toolbox, contract badge, and drawn a conclusion that was wrong in every practical way that mattered that night. About how he'd done his own version of the same thing with this job, with this life, letting himself become invisible to the world that used to know what he was capable of, because invisibility felt like safety, and safety felt like what Sophie needed. Maybe it had been what Sophie needed for a while. He wasn't sure anymore. He was less sure than he'd been, which was either wisdom or just tiredness. And at 32, he didn't always know the difference. What he knew was that the work in that hangar had mattered. Not because it had saved a company or a contract or preserved Vanessa Sterling's billion-dollar empire, though it had done all of those things. Because there had been a specific moment, standing at the fueling station, telling a 23-year-old technician to hold the fuel line, knowing that the person with authority over the situation was about to tell him he was wrong, where the question had been very simple. Do you say what you know, or do you say what's easier? Ryan had said what he knew. That was all. That was the whole decision, made in a second, in a worn jacket, with mud on his boots. Not because he was built differently from other people, or had some exceptional quality that made it easy. He'd said it because not saying it felt worse than the alternative, and sometimes that's the whole of courage. Not the absence of the cost, just the refusal to pay the other cost instead. He thought about this the first morning he walked into Sterling Aeronautics headquarters in Reston, 3 weeks after the night in the hangar, as the new director of independent safety operations. The building was different in daylight than it had been in the rainy midnight he'd first driven past it, glass and steel, professionally landscaped, the kind of corporate campus that announces itself quietly and expensively. His name was on a temporary badge that would be replaced with a permanent one this week. He had an office, which was something he hadn't had in 4 years, and which turned out to contain a desk, a window with an unremarkable view of a parking structure, and a chair that was slightly too large for the desk, creating a proportion problem that he put in the mental category of things to fix eventually. He met his team that morning, 3 people, which was enough to start with and would grow as the division developed its protocols. A senior technician named Marcus, who had been with Sterling Aeronautics for 6 years and who had the specific combination of deep practical knowledge and mild institutional frustration that meant he had been right about things more often than the organization had allowed him to act on them. A systems analyst named Priya, young and precise and prone to asking questions in the direct, unembellished way of someone who genuinely wants the answer rather than performing curiosity. And Claire, the system administrator who had found the investment archive in a mislabeled file folder at 2 a.m. and had printed the documents without being asked, and who had asked Vanessa for a transfer to the new division before the employment agreement had even been finalized. Ryan shook hands with each of them and sat down at the table in the division's small conference room, which smelled like new paint and had a whiteboard that nobody had written on yet. "Here's what this division does," he said. "We verify. We document. We say what we find to the people who need to hear it through channels that are designed so that saying it is possible regardless of who it inconveniences. That's the whole job." He looked at each of them. "If you find something wrong with an aircraft and someone with authority over you tells you that you're exaggerating, you bring it to me. If I find something wrong with an aircraft and Vanessa Sterling herself tells me I'm exaggerating, it goes into the federal reporting channel. Nobody in this chain overrides findings based on schedules or contracts or financial pressure. Not ever." He paused. "Questions?" Marcus looked at him with the slightly evaluative expression of a person who has been told versions of this kind of speech before and is waiting to see if this one is actually different. "What happens when the pressure is real? When there's a demonstration window and a contract and 100 people whose jobs depend on the flight happening?" "Then the pressure is real," Ryan said, "and we still say what we find." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "You've been in that situation." 3 weeks ago, Ryan said. "Yes." A short silence around the table, not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that happens when something true has been said and the room is integrating it. "Okay," Marcus said. Not quite the same okay Ryan had given Vanessa Sterling in that small office with the folding table and the dry erase marker smell, but the same spirit, recognition without wrapping. That works? Vanessa Sterling came to the division's conference room on Ryan's third day, unannounced, which was apparently how she operated, showing up at places when she had a reason to be there rather than scheduling her presence as a formal event. She knocked on the open door, which was a courtesy Ryan hadn't expected from a CEO in her own building, and when Ryan looked up, she said, "Do you have 10 minutes?" They walked to her office, which was on the top floor, and had a view that was considerably better than Ryan's parking structure, and sat across from each other with coffee that was considerably better than gas station quality. "The demonstration," Vanessa said. "I wanted to tell you how it went." Ryan had known it went well in the broad sense. Sterling Aeronautics hadn't collapsed, which was the most available indicator, but he hadn't heard the specific version. "Tell me." "The relay system performed exactly as designed," she said. "Every transmission, every authentication check, every emergency protocol. The Pentagon observers were," she paused, choosing the word, "satisfied, which from that group is a very strong statement." She looked at her coffee cup. "The contract was confirmed 2 days later. Full contract, full scope, with an additional security review provision attached. They want an independent safety certification process for every aircraft operating under the contract. An external review, separate from the company's internal operations." Ryan looked at her. "I told them I had an independent safety division," Vanessa said, "with federal reporting authority and full operational independence from our executive structure." A pause. "They said that was exactly what they were looking for." Ryan sat with that for a moment. The specific irony of it, that the thing Derek Vaughn had tried to use to destroy the company had become, in its aftermath, the reason the company was now more secure with its most important client than it would have been without the crisis. That the gap he'd exploited had become the structure built to fill it. "I need you to understand something," Vanessa said. She said it carefully, the way she said things when she was being precise rather than performative. "What I offered you that morning, the position, the conditions, I didn't offer it because I felt guilty. I offered it because standing in that hangar at 5 in the morning watching you work, I understood that the structure of my company had been set up to make it impossible for the right person to do the right thing. And you did it anyway, not because the structure supported you, but in spite of it." She held his gaze. "I don't want to run a company that depends on people doing the right thing in spite of the structure. I want the structure to make it possible." Ryan looked at her. Outside her window, the parking structure that wasn't visible from his office was also not visible from hers. She had trees and the access road to the airfield, and a slice of sky that was doing something bright and unremarkable on a Tuesday morning in early fall. "That's a hard thing to actually build," Ryan said. "It's easier to say than to maintain." "I know," Vanessa said. "There will be a moment," he said, "when the pressure is real again. When there's a contract and a deadline and a flight window, and someone in my division is saying the aircraft isn't ready. And everything in the financial logic of the situation will push toward finding a reason why they're wrong." "I know," she said again. "I need to know that when that moment comes, you're going to do what's hard rather than what's easy." Vanessa looked at him for a long moment. Not defensively, with the specific seriousness of someone who is being asked a real question and is trying to give a real answer. "I can't promise I'll be perfect," she said. "I wasn't perfect 3 weeks ago. I've made faster decisions with less information and been wrong before, and I'll probably be wrong again about something I shouldn't be wrong about." She set her coffee cup down. "What I can promise is that the structure won't allow me to override your division unilaterally. I built that into your employment agreement on purpose, not as a courtesy, because I don't trust pressure not to affect my judgment, and I wanted a check on my own judgment that I couldn't remove in a moment of urgency." It was, Ryan thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to him in a professional context in a long time. Not the most reassuring. Honestly, it was a little unsettling because it was an admission of human fallibility from a person whose fallibility had real consequences. But it was true, and true mattered more than reassuring, usually. "Okay," Ryan said. Vanessa almost smiled. "You keep saying that." "It keeps being the right answer," Ryan said. She did smile then. Full, brief, slightly reluctant, the kind that arrives before you decide whether to allow it. "Get back to work," she said. Your team has a certification review at 400. I know, Ryan said. I scheduled it. He stood up, took his coffee cup, and walked back to his office with the unremarkable view of the parking structure. At his desk, he opened the certification review file and began reading. His phone buzzed, a text from Sophie's school confirming this week's pickup schedule, a reminder that he'd volunteered to bring oranges to soccer practice on Thursday, a note from the parent coordinator that parking on the south side of the field would be restricted. He read all three, responded to the coordinator's note with the orange confirmation, and put his phone face down on the desk. He had a 2 p.m. certification review. He had oranges to buy Thursday morning. He had a whiteboard in his conference room that still hadn't been written on, and a division that needed protocols built from scratch. He had a 6-year-old who was going to ask him what he did at work today, with the complete and specific expectation that he would have a real answer. He had a job that let him be home by 6. Ryan Calder opened the certification file, found the first page, and read the first line. Then he read the second. Then he got to work. Not because it was dramatic. Not because the night in the hangar had changed him into something larger than he'd been before. He got to work because the work was real and the work mattered, and because on a stormy night 3 weeks ago in a hangar outside Reston, Virginia, he had been the only person in the room who knew what he was looking at, and he had said so clearly and plainly at a cost he was willing to pay. That was the whole story. A man who paid attention, a man who said what he found, a man who understood that a 6-year-old's badly proportioned crayon airplane on a nightstand was not in competition with the work. It was the reason the work had to be done right. The sky outside his window was doing nothing remarkable, just being sky, on a Tuesday, in the ordinary way. Ryan read the file. Outside, somewhere over Virginia, a Gulfstream G700 was airborne.